Welcome to Line of Duty Series 6, Week 2, and boy, what a meaty episode. You can tell the game's really stepping up this week because Steve's at his old tricks again, meeting Kate in dark alleys with check out that graffiti. Whoa, Kate was not impressed. Indeed, there's some tension between the old AC-12 gang in this particular episode where Kate really comes into the focus because it turns out that she's being investigated on her end by Joe Davison, and at the same time their relationship or close friendship continues to advance, and Kate actually pulls one over the AC-12 investigation because at one point they go in to investigate the whole corruption side of things and put the heat on Davison's department concerning the whole investigation and potential corruption from last week, and Davison turns the tables on them. It's a great scene actually because she basically says that because there's a suspicion of corruption, she tells them to go away, that they can't move forward until everything's been cleared up and it's been investigated. Now Steve helpfully mentions, well, wouldn't we investigate that? And she's like, even so, you can't be on our turf doing this while there's an investigation. And it's a brilliant supercharged scene because Steve's basically like, yeah, you just did it to make mugs of us, and Joe coolly replies, well, that's just the bonus. And that dickhead Birmingham chief of police, he's like, yes, priceless. Which is really funny. It's always hilarious to see someone get one over on Steve because they can't have things going exactly their way. But in any event, Hastings, looking his charming, shady self, pulls some strings within the department to get the investigation back on board. I think that's one thing about the episode, is that it sort of felt like you didn't need that original scene with AC-12 going in to investigate, only to be turned away, only for Hastings then to pull some strings. But I think it worked dramatically and was such a great scene, and I think it just sort of showed that, Joe essentially wasn't going to be like messed about and was gonna stand up to them, that there's more to her than meets the eyes. But we do see Hastings sort of work his magic with like the superior, so to speak, because originally they're not going to let them continue with the investigation. He gives Steve the authority to go back in and helpfully describes that Kate has cooked her goose, which is an awesome expression. I think I'm going to work that into many a conversation from now. Maybe it's an Irish expression, but Hastings is on great form in this episode, and that's because they come to the conclusion that it was actually Kate who ratted them out to the Davison side, that she knew because she'd been talking to Steve. Their romantic meetings in the dark graffiti alley had led her to know that they were going to investigate Joe Davison. So she gave Davison the head up, and that's how they were able to turn the table. So we then go for a drink in this episode, just to sort of unwind and relax. And that's another really enjoyable scene because there's two guys trying to sort of chat them up, basically. And I just love the scene because Joe basically flashes her patch at them, and that's it. Whoa. That's the end of their sort of chatting up. And there's a nice little interplay between them where she's like, sorry, I've sort of killed the mood, haven't I? And no, basically Kate's like, don't worry, they're not my type anyway. And they actually arrange a date for the next week, or it feels like a date. Again, they seem to be going in this direction with their potential relationship. But of course, that sort of gets put on hold when AC-12 come knocking, and they actually decide to put Jo under suspicion, to call her in for an interview, and that's obviously going to be the big set piece of the episode. One or two other little scenes, very impressive the way they handle these, but there's actually a connection to the whole Jimmy Savile case, where it actually gets shown on this archive footage when they're looking into like the journalist, the one who's been murdered, Vale, and that she, back in whenever it would have been, 2011, 2012, she actually was investigating the whole corruption stuff with Jimmy Savile and with the police, which obviously is a real life thing which was revealed to be going on. And I think what's clever about that scene is that when the scene started and they were watching this video, like this TV clip, I sort of thought, yeah, it's funny they haven't brought up Savile before. Of course they have, I've forgotten this, but it's actually really clever because what they're watching is like an old bit of footage, and that she was, investigating this. And they work it back into this series really nicely. It's a smooth bit of storytelling because the journalist was investigating it. It gives the police potential motive to have her basically put out of the way, sort of like, killed. And they established then it's highly possible that the police were framing this other person for it, and that they were replacing DNA basically to fit the Boyles character up. Interesting tidbit is that they mention H again in this episode, which you thought might have been put to bed in the last series, but of course there was still some lingering doubt in series 5 when it was suggested and there might still be one last member of H, like a fourth person. And that's subtly mentioned in this episode because we have a scene with Steve and the new she says, do you mind me asking what these photographs are? And Steve's kind of like, well, it's it's the chief's thing, and he still won't let this lie, sort of thing. And she kind of asks Steve, well, what do you think? Do you think there's still a fourth man out there? And there's just this lingering sort of doubt in the room. And I mention that because it makes me sort of think that they're going to return to that at some point in the season, that they're definitely planting the seeds, and that it may well be paid off. We might get an answer to that later in the season, in which case it's really good storytelling. That's really impressive stuff. The most entertaining line of the episode might actually come from the Brummie police chief, when he finds out that AC-12 are raiding his place later, which, as it happens, is thanks to Jo. He has this line to Steve, because he's basically really put out by it, so he has this line to Steve, well, if you come across my porn mags, feel free to have a look at them as well. Which is great. He's one of those sort of douchebag characters that I really enjoy listening to, just getting into a strop. And it's obvious those interrogation scenes, and it's a great back and forth where she holds her own pretty well, because they bring up the whole issue of the van from last week and why it was intercepted, and why did Jo believe that they were criminals, that they were up to no good. And it's quite a realistic exchange where she's talking about how they were suspiciously parked outside of a bookies, and none of them was reading a paper or anything, and they obviously question, well, you only got a limited view. How could you deduce that in a split second, so to speak, or very quickly anyway? And Jo's kind of like, well, police instinct, basically. And Hastings like, oh, we all have those from time to time. I'm starting to have that right about now. And it's just one of these great interview scenes where they're really turning the heat up on Joe. But she kind of stands firm. She kind of says, well, because Steve mentions that they don't have like criminal records or anything, and there's this nice bit of detail about how apparently, like the morning, that time of day is the least profitable, sort of time for bookies. So actually, they wouldn't. A robbery would be more advised later in the day, let's say. But uh, Joe basically swats that away, says, "Well, it's an amateur crime carried out by amateurs," which is a really good line too. But you sort of have this back and forth, and she scores 1 or 2 points. But there's sort of eventually this sort of turn from her where, to the shock of everyone in the room, she actually agrees with them that there probably was foul play, because they go back and forth on the whole Terry Boyles thing, where she basically interjects and says, "Well, he fits the profile of someone who was obsessed with Gail, and that obviously he could have tossed away, the clothing type thing as a bit of evidence." And Steve says, "Well, it's speculation," and Joe actually comes back with a good answer to that, which is, "Well, yes, that's why I didn't pursue like a prosecution. That's why it was released," which is fair. Even Hastings, you can see, nodding at that one. But in any case, they finally decide to arrest her. Then they've got enough on her to be suspicious and to investigate further. And that's when she kind of digs the heels in, and she basically, as they're about to get up and go, she says, "Well, if you're going to investigate my premises and that, you should, under suspicion, you should also like investigate the other officers who would have previous information of that whole thing with the van, and the 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 deal being going down, the our investigation." And she gives the names, including that Brummy police guy. That's the scene he has with Steve. But yeah, one of them is actually Vida, who we've obviously found out was having a thing with Joe originally, and we see her in this episode looking just really scared and petrified and sort of freaking out. But yeah, there's a back and forth there, and she really puts Vida in it because, as it turns out, the kind of phone which made the call originally to the van is revealed to be Vida. It's her phone, but they sort of talk to Vida, who's I think the actress does a good job actually of like being really intimidated and nervous, and I think kind of just showing her age and inexperience, because I think she is meant to be a bit more of a rookie, although I think she has been in a couple seasons now. But anyway, she does get really emotional and crack under pressure. But it's a clever turn in the episode, because it obviously, it's Joe sort of thinking on her feet, and that it shows that maybe she has sort of planted this, she has set this up, and that she's actually been doing this a long time. This, and says, reveals the whole thing with the affair, the relationship, and says she planted it. Basically, she didn't need access to my flat because we were in a relationship. No doubt AC12 are going to go back in hard. And just returning to the whole H thing and that plot, later on, the episode actually ends with Joe meeting up in a car with this young police officer who we've actually seen earlier in the episode, and Kate makes a habit of have I seen you before sort of thing, and it's another good payoff sort of scene because Joe quickly moves on the conversation and says thank you to the guy about, well, that's what happens when you're a rat when talking about Veda. And they just pull up next to this other car with this man with a massive beard. This guy looked like a right Viking or something like that. And my mind got racing. Well, who is this guy? Could this guy be something to do with H? Could he be the fourth man or something like that? They're dramatic moments. I thought there's a scene at the end with Joe where she starts like screaming and kind of hitting the window, and I thought that was a bit over the top and not really needed. But generally, it was a really good episode. Maybe one or two scenes that could have been left out, but there's some stuff happening with Steve and like his drug addiction and on the pills, and we actually see him go over to this girl's house. This girl who her husband was a copper, and he died on the job. And obviously Steve has sort of got close to her since because of knowing her husband and stuff. So there could be a bit of romance in the air there, but it's again the sort of scene that maybe could have been dropped from the episode, but it depends where they go with it. Knowing how smart this show is and how well thought out it is, there could be a really good payoff and some meaty stuff coming. Let me know what you thought of episode 2 of series 6 in the comments below. Like and subscribe and all that stuff, and I'll see you guys again soon. Goodbye.